All right, that said, what we're going to do now is see a whole bunch of slides. I'm going to stick right here near the microphone. It might be good if we could darken the room just a little bit. Maybe this spotlight on me, if it's not necessary, we could maybe kill that. Or have just a slighter light. One of the whole things here is, in my Lost Cities books that I'm well known for, I'm the author of over 20 different books, and my books are in many different foreign languages. But I've written a whole bunch of series of books about lost cities, and they're all about Atlantis. They're all about ancient civilizations, about civilization going back over 10,000 years ago. And this is what's happening daily, is that archaeologists, mainstream archaeology, anthropologists, they're pushing civilization and mankind farther and farther back all the time. When you're talking about civilizations that are over 10,000 years old, we don't really have a name for them, so we call them Atlantis. The story of Atlantis really comes from Plato, the Greek philosopher. He wrote several books that talk about Atlantis, the Critias and the Timaeus. He says right in his books that they are Egyptian stories. The Egyptians were talking to his uncle Solon in a temple in Egypt, and they said to him, "You Greeks, you don't even know your own history. Greece is much older than you even think. Your own country." And then he goes on to tell them how the Greeks fought a war with Atlantis, and it's all over 10,000 years ago. So Plato and the Egyptians automatically said, and it's quite detailed, that Atlantis was out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that was out into the Atlantic. And even though Atlantis has been placed all over the world, small Greek islands, it's been placed in the Sahara Desert, it's been placed in Indonesia, it's been placed in South America. I tend to be a classicist, and I believe that Atlantis is in the Atlantic somewhere near the Azores, the Bahamas, or Cuba. The whole story of Atlantis, too, that it was a city of concentric canals and land. You would go through various locks to enter into the inner city of Atlantis. There was a huge mountain that was to one side of Atlantis. It was very much a maritime culture. Giant ships were coming and going. And in theory, these ships went all over the world, according to Plato. You have more books have supposedly been written about Atlantis than any other subject. Even the Bible talks about Atlantis and floods and worlds before our own. You have other lost lands like Lemuria, Mu out in the Pacific, the whole idea of South America and the Amazon being a sea, the idea that ancient civilizations 20,000 years ago were building giant port cities, huge blocks of stone. Back in right about 1999, a Russian-Canadian crew that was working in Cuba released this one sonar photo from a robotic sub off the western part of Cuba, 2,000 feet underwater. And they claimed they had found a city there, that had city streets and pyramids and things like that. And they then released this one photo. Even National Geographic got involved in this. We're going to fund another expedition to go underwater in Cuba. That never happened. Around Bimini, the famous Bimini Wall. This is not very far off Florida. The Edgar Cayce group has gotten interested in that. Sunken cities are all over the Mediterranean. There's over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. This one is off of Greece, off the Peloponnese, called Elphanesos. About 10 years ago, Egyptian Antiquities announced that they had found 35 kilometers into the Mediterranean. They found 2 cities that were dynastic Egyptian cities, and they began excavating them, and they're underwater. Over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And this is all going back to cataclysms, to Atlantis. This is the Yonaguni site, which is off of Japan. Also, thought by some people as very controversial whether it is some kind of submerged megalithic man-made site. Mainstream archaeologists are now saying that the oldest ruins in the world are on the island of Malta, and they're giving them a date of around 9,000 years old. That's about 7,000 BC. That is quite old. They're megalithic buildings, and this is now starting to get towards the time of Atlantis. In my book on lost cities of Atlantis and ancient Europe and the Mediterranean, I talk about how Malta and the whole Mediterranean area was a series of lakes and things, apparently 10,000, 12,000 BC. And then with some cataclysm, the sinking of Atlantis, the whole Mediterranean was hit by a giant wave and flooded in. Later, the Black Sea was flooded, and there's been a number of TV shows and stuff like that on the Discovery Channel and whatnot about that. The whole idea, too, of the ancients, Atlantis, whoever they were, building out of giant blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons, even 1,000 tons. The largest known cut stone blocks in the world are today at Baalbek in Lebanon. This is near the Syrian border. These giant blocks here, the largest of all the blocks at Baalbek, weighs 1,000 tons, and it's this one right here, 200,000 pounds. Even today, you know, the largest cranes are built at dams and things like that, and they have to be huge stationary cranes to lift huge blocks like that. Modern archaeologists, when they look at Baalbek, I mean, this is, and this is something I stress a lot in my books on lost cities and technology of the gods and Vimanas and stuff, is that when you're building out of giant blocks of stone like this, you have to really want to build with these things. You've chosen to do the most difficult thing imaginable. And for any construction engineer, architect, to have to build like this is extreme. Modern day archaeologists have to explain this. And it's very difficult. It's one reason why you won't see very many TV shows about, say, Baalbek and some of the other things I'm about to show you, because they're not easily explained by archaeologists. Archaeologists had to explain how these 1,000-ton blocks at Baalbek were moved. And this is how they explained it, that these huge cages are built around these blocks. And there's small hourglass cuts or pudding to them that have these little kind of T-shaped stones that will fit in here, and you have a 1,000-ton block like this. So now you're going to have to build a huge cage all around this giant block, and you've got all these pulleys and stuff, what they're doing there. And when you do all this, go to this tremendous effort, you would in fact move that block a few inches, and then you would do it again. Now, I mean, no construction crew today would try and build like that, even with all the modern saws and giant construction equipment that we have. We just wouldn't do that. This is an old National Geographic illustration from the 40s, but notice here, this is actually from supposedly of the building of the Parthenon, but you see how they're fixing these blocks together with what they call keystone cuts and clamps, and that are these T-shaped clamps here that we see. And that is molten metal that's poured into blocks. And it's a way of fixing huge blocks of stone together. And they're called keystone clamps and keystone cuts. And you're going to see some more of those. It's a very unusual way of building. The whole idea that civilization is over 10,000 years old, I mean, and this is very much what the story of Atlantis is and what I promote in all my books. They're now saying that the Sphinx, Robert Schoch, the geologist from Boston, is saying that the Sphinx is over 10,000 years old, and it has to do with water weathering that the Sphinx has. John Anthony West, a friend of mine, he thinks the Sphinx may be as much as 30,000 years old. Right near the Sphinx is what they call the Valley Temple of Kefren, and it's a megalithic structure that's built right to the left side of the Sphinx. And it has unusual building properties, as you see. Stones are notched in. You see these unusual sort of polygonal blocks with a lot of corners and notching, perfectly fitting. Blocks that weigh anywhere from, 800 pounds to several tons to up to even 20 or 50 tons. In Egypt are a couple of really unusual buildings like this one, which is called the Osirion, and it's at the Abydos temple in southern Egypt. And there's a giant dynastic temple there that's beautiful. But as you go at the back side of that temple, you see this thing, and this is called the Osirion, or the tomb of Osiris. And it's actually beneath the ground, and it was in a swamp, and it's been underwater, literally, for hundreds of years. So the Egyptian government has been pumping water out of this thing for the last 15 years or so that they can even explore it themselves. And it's thought that this is what they call pre-dynastic Egyptian. This is before the pharaohs, before the time we think of Egypt with Akhenaten and Nefertiti and Ramses and all those guys. Look again at some of the blocks of stone here, and these are probably over 10,000 years old. You have the same notching, you have this sort of pillowing little knobs and things like that. They don't know what these are for. They seem to have something to do with the building. But this kind of construction is sometimes called Atlantean construction. And Thor Heyerdahl, who was also, I knew him, he called this a fingerprint construction. Later, Graham Hancock, also a friend of mine, came out with his book, Fingerprints of the Gods. All right, now we're in Cuzco in Peru. And this is the famous stone of 12 angles. It's in an alleyway in Cuzco. In fact, this stone appears on the Cuzco beer, and it's part of the beer label there. And it's this stone with the angles. Again, you see the curious notching. It's very, very fine stonework. You see also these knobs and things like we were seeing at the Osirion in Egypt. This kind of perfect fitting together, this polygonal jigsaw construction, one of the things it does is particularly in earthquake zones, there's no mortar or anything that's used, and the blocks are locked in together. And they, like a jigsaw puzzle, when an earthquake moves through it, the blocks jumble, but they're locked together, and the walls will stay stable. This wall here, which also looks like what we saw at the Valley Temple of Kefren in Egypt, also in Peru, this is the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo. And the Japanese emperor today is supposed to be the last of the ancient Sun Kings that used to rule the world. And he lives in an ancient megalithic building with walls, just like in South America or in Peru or other places like that. Well, this is really unusual construction and ancient, too. You cannot slip a piece of paper or a knife blade between these blocks. This site here is a very unusual site. It is in northern Greece, near to Albania. It's known as the Necromanticon. And it's an underground site, but it also has this polygonal blocks of stone, perfectly fit together, notched. This site is actually underground, also like the Osirion in Egypt, and it wasn't even discovered by Greek archaeologists until the 1960s. And in fact, they identify this place with the river Styx and the underworld and Hades, and it being just such an ancient site. This is Cuzco, high up in the Andes Mountains of South America. It's about 12,000 feet. Right up on a hill, right above Cuzco, is the ancient fortress of Sacsayhuaman. It's also a megalithic site. Giant blocks of stone fitted together. Here they're limestone. They've been dragged quite a distance from quarries. There are also these polygonal jigsaw patterns, blocks of stone fitted together, small stones, little notches. And they don't know what this really structure was for. I mean, it's gigantic and huge, huge walls stacked behind each other. But yet exactly what its purpose was. A major battle between the Incas and the Spanish was actually fought at Sacsayhuaman, and it's right near to Cuzco. This is Machu Picchu, the fantastic, beautiful city, high in the mountains of Peru. It's the #1 tourist site in all of South America. It's a fantastic place. Peru, at Machu Picchu, is a megalithic city. It's an ancient city. It's a secret city, high up on a mountain where it can't be seen. And Machu Picchu is a megalithic city. It's most of it, particularly the central part, is built out of finely cut blocks of granite. Also, you see the notches, huge lichen patches, giant blocks that are, here we go. And you also see how the notching and these little pillowy knobs and things like that come out. This kind of a thing, huge lichen patches, very, very fine stonework of cutting and fitting stones together. Now, near to Machu Picchu is another place called Ollantaytambo. And Ollantaytambo is on a cliff up above the Urubamba River that goes down to Machu Picchu. And as you hike up the walls of this cliff, you go up some terraces, and you suddenly come to walls like this. And you see again the jigsaw megalithic building, the perfect fitting. You see large lichen patches. You see these knobs and things like that. Really, really fine stonework fitted together. You've got these knobs. You see again the corners fitting in perfectly, the way of notching these buildings together. Doorways like that, more knobs. Look at the structure like above this door. Now suddenly you go from megalithic building down below to this crummy rock building up above. Now who's building that? As you get up to the top of Ollantaytambo, you suddenly see these giant blocks of stone, of granite. They're weighing 50 tons of stuff like that. You have this part, which they call it a sun temple. It's basically just a wall of these blocks. Again, huge blocks fitted together with these knobs and things like that. The far end has this block that's fallen over. You can see how this block on the right has smaller blocks underneath it. Once again, as you come around the corner, you see this wall. Giant blocks fitted together. Okay, and like this one, and now look at the notching on the top right of this block, and then look at how these other blocks have pulled apart, and now look at this crummy rubble on the right side that's filled that in. Now, one of my big fights is with mainstream archaeologists. Now, let me tell you, this wall that we're looking at, this is what the archaeologists say, mainstream. They say that the Incas built this wall just about 200 years before the Spanish got there. I mean, this, according to them, this wall is not thousands of years old or anything like that. This wall is built, say, around 1400 AD. And this is what archaeologists say. They're saying the Incas dragged this giant block up right here, like we see it. And they put it right where it is. And then the Incas filled in this wall right here. I mean, this is how it was in Inca times. This is how it was when the Spanish got here. And so here we have another view of these walls. See these giant blocks that are just lying around? Well, in Inca times, this was how it was too. And in Spanish times, it's how it is right now. No one can move these blocks. All these crummy walls, this crummy filler. I mean, the mainstream archaeologists, we're talking Yale, Harvard, UCLA, they're saying, yeah, 200 years before the Spanish got there, the Incas dragged these giant blocks up, just left them like that. And even though it's quite clear that these other huge blocks, I mean, they're weighing 100 tons, even 200 tons. You know, it's supposed to have another giant block fitted perfectly next to it. But no, they blew it off. You know, they thought, screw it. You know, this is a lot of trouble doing all this stuff. I mean, you know, they just left these blocks. Okay, and that's one of the things at Baalbek and other places like that. At some point, because of some cataclysm, some big change, I mean, everyone just stopped working. I mean, they just stopped doing everything, and they just left giant blocks, like some kids, huge, tinker toys and building blocks. They just lie scattered around. Now look at this. Okay, we're talking about here what I was mentioning before, keystone cuts. These are, so you have these giant blocks, all right, and they weigh maybe up like 1,000 tons. They're not going anywhere, you wouldn't think. But no, they still want to tie those blocks to another block by pouring these clamps and making these keystone cuts, and then it has to have another corresponding block fitted next to it, and then molten metal is poured into it. Certain areas, like some of the blocks, the quarries where this came from is nearby. This is one of the blocks that never made it to the quarry. All right, if you look at the sort of, as this mountain is coming down, just to the right there, you can see the quarry. I mean, the quarry for these blocks is 15 miles up on top of a mountain where it's like this mountain has just been blasted with something. Huge blocks come down. They square the blocks. They have to actually drag them all the way down this mountain, across a river, and then up another mountain to where they're going. Now, I mean, and this is one of the things that you have to ask yourself, and that mainstream archaeologists don't ask themselves, because they're not engineers. They're not architects. They don't have to go out and build these things. But yet, I mean, why? Why would somebody go around trying to build with giant blocks of stone that seem impossible to lift when you don't have to do that? That's not how people do. You can build with small blocks of stone. You can build with bricks. You can cut a giant block of stone that's like the size of a semi-truck. You could cut into it 100 small blocks and build with those. But the people are trying to build with giant, huge blocks of stone. And they can move them. They can move them around. In the eastern jungles of Peru, there's a satellite photo, a Landsat photo. As you go into the Madre de Dios jungles there, this is all the eastern part of Peru going towards Brazil and the Amazon jungle. There are no roads out there. There's vast mountain jungle. It's huge area. And they have found what appear to be satellites of pyramids and things in this area right around in here. And you have what appear to be a kind of egg carton shapes. Expeditions have gone into this area, totally vanished. The Peruvian government has tried to fly helicopters and things like that into there. I mean, they just don't know what's out there in those jungles. And every year they announce something new that they found. As you get towards Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku, you come to these weird towers. These are known to be pre-Inca. They're also megalithic. They don't know what these things were for. They were perhaps some kind of smelting areas. I believe that a lot of Tiwanaku and what went on in Peru and stuff was metallurgy, a lot of smelting and mining operations. Along the western side of Lake Titicaca, you come to this weird Stargate thing. This is this door carved into solid rock. It's like a door, giant door, going nowhere. And you would think that some other giant building or something was at one point, fitted up against this or something like that. They don't know who built this, why, what it's for. They sometimes call it the Devil's Door or the Door of Amaru Muru. As you go up, this is about 6 feet high. The smaller little door, the whole thing itself it's about 40, 50 feet high, little channels and things like that. And you just have to kind of wonder, like, yeah, was there some other ancient building here at some point? We just don't know. There are false doors, and that's a curious thing too. The Egyptians did that. They would put false doors. You can see them at Giza and certain temples where there's just doors and things like that in the rock, kind of like a interdimensional doorway or something like that. Like at Abydos, these are also false Egyptian doors. As you go into Lake Titicaca, there's a lot of unusual stuff there. There's a lot of UFO activity. Many people who live around Lake Titicaca believe that UFOs come from underneath the lake and the water there. There's a lake that's near to Cusco too, a much smaller lake, and this is it. It's called Huayna Laguna, Lake Huayna, and what I've been told by my friends in Peru and around Cusco, and one of the main highways goes nearby this lake, and you can see it. And allegedly, at 4 in the morning, almost every day, they say, it seems like it wouldn't happen every day, but UFOs come out of this lake, and it's a small lake. And what they claim is that there's a small fishing village there. And I went there one time, and I with a translator, because they speak Quechua and stuff, I asked a guy too, I said, is it true UFOs come out of this lake? And yeah, he was like, oh yeah, we see them all the time. Allegedly, you go out in a boat on this lake, and then this is easily reached by road too. In the middle of the lake is a hole. This is what they say. And it's a relatively shallow lake, but in the middle of this lake is this circular, bottomless hole that goes into the earth. And it's like some tube, they believe, and discoid UFO craft come out of it. I've always thought, I haven't ever done this, but I've always thought, yeah, I should go there and camp out for a couple of nights at this lake, see what's going on. I'm not to do it yet. We're back to Lake Titicaca. Lake Titicaca is a huge lake, very deep. There are ruins underneath it. So there is UFO activity. Even both the Bolivian government and the Peruvian government, the lake's sort of half and half in both countries, do underwater archaeological stuff there. One of the strange things about Lake Titicaca is that it has seahorses in it, and seahorses are really an ocean critter, and they're freshwater seahorses. And today, Lake Titicaca is a freshwater lake, but it's thought, and this is what guys like James Churchward, particularly the guys who get into Lemuria and stuff like that, and Mu, in that South America was at one point at sea level. Tiwanaku and stuff was a port city, and there was a port, and that Lake Titicaca was a saltwater lake originally, similar to this lake that's in Nicaragua. That's now a freshwater lake, but it has freshwater sharks in it now. This is the famous Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku. At Tiwanaku, too, are these giant, massive andesite. The gate itself is actually moved from another place. It's like fitted other buildings. This is like what I was talking about, that gate. I mean, you're just looking at remnants of huge, massive buildings, and a door that's carved. Other big walls would have been fitted against it. They're gone now. There's all kinds of weird pyramids, sunken temples at Tiwanaku. This is one of the sunken temples. It supposedly has a face for every different race of mankind. You've got the oddball statues. They're wearing turbans and things like that. Tiwanaku is a subterranean area. They're just finding this out. They're now excavating all of these tunnels and rivers and things that are underwater like this. And in fact, they're trying to prohibit photography there now. But apparently, Tiwanaku had water, rivers running through it. And at the very least, it was like some giant metallurgical plant where they were washing ores and stuff like that. This is the famous Kon-Tiki statue, also that Thor Heyerdahl talked about. And you'll notice that he's holding his hands in the Kon-Tiki fashion, or the Tiki fashion. That is one hand over your stomach and another hand over your heart. Your sort of hands on your torso. And that's a special position of hands and stuff like that. In my book on the Olmecs and things, I talk about Kwazuo, this other position. I won't get too much into that today. They say that one of the largest pyramids in the world is this pyramid at Tiwanaku, in fact. And it's the Akapana. It had a lake at the top. It too was part of some processing plant or something like that. As you go about a mile north of Tiwanaku, into the same complex, you have the Pumapunku area. And this is, again, giant blocks of andesite, 100-ton, 200-ton stone blocks, just scattered around. And you see, again, these keystone cuts. And now at Machu Picchu and Ollantaytambo, they're by the Incas. And they're in Egypt too, they're in Greece. And here they are at Tiwanaku. These unusual clamps, these cuts are cut. It's a very unusual way of fitting blocks together too. And you're going to pour metal clamps in there. Now, I mean, for this to be somehow, this is what mainstream archaeologists are saying too. They're saying that this is an independent thing. You know, that certainly the buildings in Tiwanaku they're not related to buildings in Egypt or the Mediterranean or someplace. They couldn't be. But they're using the same unusual building techniques. How does that fit? Archaeologists, and we're talking archaeologists at UCLA, archaeologists at Harvard and Yale, they're saying, yeah, they independently just created all this stuff. That's what they say. So you have these giant blocks. It's like Tiwanaku. The whole area has been hit by some huge tidal wave and cataclysm that wiped it out. More of these keystone cuts. I mean, some kind of mud tidal wave just hit these buildings, wiped them out. Even today, areas like that, these are blocks of stone just, standing on mud cakes and things. Here are more of these blocks. This is a typical archaeological trenching dig. This is also at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. And here again, you see the keystone cuts. The metal clamps are always removed. I mean, any wandering tribe coming along, I mean, they would immediately grab one of these metal clamps and hammer it into a spearhead or a sword or a dagger or something like that. Same thing here. See, look how these blocks are stone are just standing on pillars of mud. I mean, something just wiped this building out. Mainstream archaeologists claim, oh no, the Spanish just pulled it down. You know? And the Incas built it 200 years before they got there. That's what they're saying. This is what one of these clamps looks like inside the blocks, holding them together. Now let's go back to Egypt. This is at Luxor Temple. These are, again, keystone cuts, holding these clamps. Molten metals are poured into that. Modern archaeologists see no connection with this. How about that? Aren't they clever? Now look at keystone cuts. Here's what they're doing in Egypt. This is at Edfu. You can see how this is a dynastic Egyptian wall, but it has keystone cuts and clamps all over it on a vertical wall. They were never meant to be there. Every one of those blocks is from some other temple meant to do something else, and it's been removed, and that wall has been built. And you're not going to pour metal clamps. A few of the blocks have been put back together for some reason. They just thought, oh, these two blocks go together. But that's not where they really go. Let's go back to Tiwanaku again. We're high in the mountains of the Andes. This is some pottery. This is one of the guys. He's wearing a turban. This is something that Atlanteans supposedly did. Also at Tiwanaku, they wore turbans. He's wearing a turban. And he looks pretty American Indian, this guy. Very sort of Andean, kind of Indian. But now look at these other guys. Like the guy at the bottom, he looks more Chinese. The guy at the top, he's got a thick mustache and a beard. American Indians, by the way, don't have mustaches and beards. They don't have to shave. They can't have a mustache. They can't have a beard. And we see this also with the Olmecs. You have the weird heads, trophy heads. You have a lot of red hair in South America too. And you start to get into these weird skulls. All right, you get these cone head guys. They have these really long, gated skulls. The scientific term for this, dolichocephalus. These guys are from Ica, Peru, near Nazca. Really, really extreme heads here. This is about as extreme as I get, but this is still pretty common. And yeah, here we'll go back to this one. This guy on the left, quite a square head. I mean, running into these guys in a dark alley wouldn't be too fun, you know. The Olmecs also did this, and the whole thing of squashing heads, elongating them. There are techniques to do this. We don't know why people did it. We don't know whether it had to do with extraterrestrials, whether they wanted to have these elongated heads. It had something to do with the elite and the rulers. The Olmecs did this. This is one of the Olmec statues. The Olmecs were around the southern part of Mexico. And the Olmecs they wore turbans or kind of helmets on their heads. They looked very much like kind of Nigerian rugby players or something like that. They look very, very African. They also have a certain Oriental look to them as well. Archaeologists didn't even know about the Olmecs until the 1940s, when they suddenly were able to, this one right here, people were walking over these heads. And it was because of this distinct features in the art of the Olmecs, particularly the African look, and certain facial features, a frown, and things like that, that in the early 1940s, they had a huge meeting in Mexico City of all the archaeologists where they announced, they said, we found a new civilization. It's the Olmecs. They're older than the Maya. Everything that the Maya invented was really invented by the Olmecs. The rubber balls, the rubber game, the calendar, even this whole 2012 date and everything. It's all really, and the pyramids, it all goes back to the Olmecs. They found weird basalt cages and things like that. These are huge basalt crystal logs. I mean, they themselves weigh 10 tons or something like that. The cities of the Olmecs that they found around La Venta and stuff, and these are the swamps now of Mexico. Most of the major Olmec areas are in this very swampy, it's an oil area too of Mexico. But they found very fine drains. That's in my book on Technology of the Gods. That's what I talk about too. You've got to have good sanitation, good water, and before you can really then have factories and good quarries and civilization. The strange thing with the Olmecs again is that while many of the Olmecs look very African, the wide noses and thick lips, always a kind of a frown and stuff like that. But other Olmecs look quite differently. And some Olmecs look extremely oriental. This guy too, like that, with these pock marks on the heads. Some of these heads weigh like 20 tons. They're carved out of basalt. They don't know how they were able to make these. This is a weird one. This is also an Olmec head. They call it the sci-fi head. I mean, it's as bizarre, abstract art as you can think of. And extremely well made. I mean, the carvers of these stones and heads are some of the greatest artists who ever lived. They worked in jade a lot, and like the Chinese, the Olmecs, and later the Maya, also they prized jade more than anything. And it's a mystery where all the jade came from. There's only one jade mine that's known, which is in Central America. Some of the jade might have come from California and Nevada. These guys here are these Olmecs and these jade figurines. Now look at their heads. They have these long-shaped heads. I mean, these guys look weird. And this is what they look like. Elongated heads, squashed faces, standing around in these jade figurines. The more you know about the Olmecs, the weirder and weirder they get. And last year this time, I was working on my book on the Olmecs, and I found out a bunch of oddball things. I won't get into all of them today. This whole thing, these are all Olmec statues. They start looking oriental, again African. This V cleft on the head is a strange thing. They haven't figured that out. Even the whole hunchback, guys. Some Olmec artifacts are found as far south as Costa Rica and Panama. A lot of the Olmec iconography is flying. There's a lot of birdmen that are part of the Olmecs, like this one. He's from Costa Rica. This is a jade Olmec birdman. He's got the elongated head. You have these weird statues. In Guatemala and other Central American countries, they still, they find these giant statues out in the jungle and stuff, and they worship them still today. Many, also in Guatemala, they find all these giant heads. They're also Olmec heads. Some of them look African. Others are just kind of like weird, fat guys, kind of as boulders. Others look very Egyptian, like this one. And they're saying that these are all Olmecs. This is some early Olmec writing. This guy's wearing a headdress of like a bear or something. The Olmecs were really into magic mushrooms, and they were often buried with dried psychedelic mushrooms and stuff like that. It was a big thing with the Olmecs, and there's a lot of strange stuff going on with them. The idea that Kokopelli, the famous sort of Southwest, the flutist guy, you see him in Arizona so much, and he's also a hunchback, like the Olmecs. And that actually goes back to the Egyptian god Bes, who was also a hunchback and a dwarf, and he was the god of good luck. These guys are like that too. They are dwarf Olmec Atlanteans. They're Atlanteans in mainstream archaeological talk because they're holding up like the roof of a building. That makes them Atlanteans. But they're actually, again, they look very African, but they're also dwarves. And that's again, this weird god of good luck and Kokopelli. Other Olmec statues look very oriental. Guys would wear weird things on their foreheads and stuff like that, which is also what Orthodox Jews do. They take tablets of the Old Testament and they put them in a box and they put them on their forehead and stuff like that. These are Olmec guys too, but they don't look African at all. They look very Chinese, don't they? I mean, and they don't look like American Indians. Other Olmec, and this was the weird thing, the Olmecs looked much like Americans. Americans are from all over the world. They're every racial type. And so were the Olmecs. Here's an Olmec too. Only he's an Olmec with a beard and a mustache and everything. And he looks like he's some, Phoenician guy or something like that. These are all Olmec statues, very oriental. There's this very strange thing about the eunuchs and how a lot of them didn't have any genitals, which they thought was unusual. I do talk about that in the book. This guy's an Olmec too. He's looking kind of weird with his helmet on. He's got like antennas or something like that. Even Olmecs did mohawk haircuts, body piercing and mutilation. They wore bells in their noses and through their lips, much like people do today. And yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, let me tell you. Getting tattoos and body pierced and wearing a mohawk, the Olmecs were doing it 3,000 years ago, at least. These are Olmec guys too. This is what they look like. This is what, if you're walking down the street in Olmec, this is what one of these guys is going to look like. There are ways to do this. I mean, with the plates on a baby's head before they fuse, you can play with the heads. You can shape. You can create cone heads if you want. You can smash the head too. And for sure they did stuff like this, but why? I mean, did some people actually just look like this? I mean, these are part of the questions. These are Egyptians. This is Meritaten. This is one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They also had these cone heads. Tutankhamun, he was a cone head. And these are all statues of Tutankhamun found in his tomb. He also had this elongated, strange head and stuff. This was done too on weird Pacific islands. It was done in the Congo and places like that. The Kurds of northern Iraq would do this. They found this in Malta. This is actually in Africa, being done in the 1920s. People, even right up until the really modern times, like the 50s and 60s, people were still doing this to kids on remote islands, and the Kurds were still doing it too. So the whole idea of technology, and I mean, this is in my books, I mean, with the Lost Cities books and Technology of the Gods, what I'm trying to get my readers to understand is to look at the past differently. Look at ancient civilizations, not as a bunch of people just removed from cavemen, but as being advanced civilizations. So the idea that ancient civilizations had electricity, for example, well, we know they did. I mean, they found batteries and stuff like that in Baghdad. We know they had electricity. The Antikythera device, which was found also in Greece in the year 1900, was found in a Greek shipwreck that was from about 250 BC. It had all these cogged wheels. Scientists never believed that the ancients had anything like that. It has Greek inscriptions. It was a computer. It was a navigational device. It was more complicated than any Swiss clock. Later, in the 1950s, it wasn't until Scientific American and American scientists studied this thing, and they said, you know what? Finding this device is like finding a jet airplane in the tomb of King Tut. And later they actually found, stuff that virtually was that equivalent. But it showed that complicated machines and metal devices and stuff they were making these thousands of years ago. And the idea too that they had electricity. This is the temple of Dendera, temple of Hathor at Dendera. This is where in parts of the temple there's a number of areas and down in these crypts where you'll see these guys, Egyptian priests and things. They're holding these light bulb devices. Cables are coming out. It's as you look at all this stuff, you can only think, yeah, this is some kind of electrical device they're using, bulbs and stuff like that. Mainstream archaeology has to address these things. They have to answer these things, although you won't see it much in, magazines or something. Here's their explanation. These are lotuses, okay? That thing that looks like a big light bulb or whatever, that's a lotus flower, and the bulb is just the aroma of the flower, and for some reason they put a snake there, I mean, it has to be some explanation. That's it. The other explanation is that it's an electrical device, and of course, Egyptologists that cannot be the answer. So anyway, the idea that the ancients had electricity, they knew it, they used it to light temples, they had machines and things like that. This is from Panama. This is what's called a zoomorphic glyph. This is actually a gold artifact. I only have black and white photographs of it. But it's about 4 inches long. It's solid gold. By the way, gold is indestructible. All the gold of ancient times still exists today. Most metals and things are gone, but gold still exists. You cannot destroy gold. Now, this thing, Ivan T. Sanderson, as he looked at it, what they thought it was basically, it's a piece of jewelry, really, but they believed that it was essentially a model of a backhoe. So the whole idea, of having heavy machinery, bulldozers, backhoes, stuff like that. This thing, and this is what they call a zoomorphic glyph. It's like somebody comes and sees a bulldozer or a backhoe or a crane, and they basically go like, wow, that's a monster. All right, this is a zoomorphic kind of a thing too. So the idea that, okay, yeah, they had electricity. Wow, they actually had, tractors and things like that, and heavy equipment. Could they actually have had flight? Would they have had airplanes and things like that? Well, according to the ancient epics and legends, yeah, they did have flight. And these are one of the gold airplanes from the Gold Museum in Bogota. These things look like jet fighters. Again, archaeologists have to explain this. They try and say that, they're flying fish, or even bees, okay? But yeah, fish and or birds do not have tails and things exactly like airplanes and things, like this one. This is a wooden glider. It was found actually in a tomb in Saqqara, so it's an Egyptian one. And that was found in an Egyptian tomb. If you go also to Abydos, you'll see this unusual frescoes. This is actually rock inscription. It's cut into a lintel. You see what looks like a helicopter. You see this kind of jet plane too in the middle, and this is totally real. And you can see it's high up above. You need kind of a telephoto lens to get a good photo of it. But Egyptologists, again, they have to address this. This is not fake. And their answer that I'm told is that these are glyphs superimposed on each other. Whoops. But they have, but in fact, the middle one, that's more the jet fighter, not so much the helicopter, yeah, they don't have an explanation for that, so I'm told. This one right here, there is no hieroglyph or anything like that, or two hieroglyphs together that would make that. The whole idea of flight, vimanas, magic carpets, the chariots of the gods, all ancient civilizations have legends and stuff like that. Even the Ethiopians, the Kebra Nagast, have a whole thing of King Solomon flying in these airships to Ethiopia, seeing the Queen of Sheba. And she always brings her radio with her when she's Babylonian, Sumerian type stuff like these guys here. You've got what do you have? A winged disc. The three guys, they're sitting in there. They're off to see their friends, I guess. And when you go to India, I've spent a lot of time in India, Pakistan, Middle East, whatnot. And in India, they talk about the Indian epics, the Ramayana, which is part of the Mahabharata, and they read like the wildest science fiction. People are just running around in airships, blasting each other, decimating whole cities, and it all seemed like just total fantasy. But these books are quite detailed, and everyone knows about vimanas in those countries. But then when archaeologists started excavating in Pakistan and the western parts of India out in the desert, like Mohenjo-Daro and Hapra, they found these cities out in the desert. They found this new kind of writing. They didn't know it. This is a kind of extinct cattle. They don't know even exactly what that animal is. They were using it. People were found just lying dead in the streets. I mean, this is in the 1940s. This doom had taken over these cities, just like the ancient Indian epics had said. People were just lying dead in the streets, holding hands. No one later came and buried the dead or anything. And then finally the Sindh desert just covered up these cities with sand for thousands of years. And then finally British and Pakistani and Indian archaeologists started uncovering these things. The whole idea that ancient India goes back 20,000 years and stuff like that. These are these cities, these also carved into walls. This is in Saudi Arabia. Out in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert is this weird stuff. Again, doors and, you would think other buildings and things like that would be fitted up against these things. The idea of the Ramayana was that they went from Rama, supposedly his wife, ran off with some other guy. She went down to Sri Lanka. He jumps in his Vimana, goes to get her, hey, look, honey, you're coming home with me. It was basically his wife had run off with this other guy. That's what the story of the Ramayana is. Recently, too, they're now looking at Sri Lanka, and they're looking at what they call Rama's Bridge. And even they've used NASA satellite photos to show, and in India, they believe that this is a man-made causeway that's going from southern India to Sri Lanka. It's underwater right now. But it's only like 20 feet or 30 feet underwater, and ships go over it, but through satellite photos they've been able to find it. In India, they believe this is man-made, like some big bridge or something like that to the Key West or something like that. When you read a modern novel, James Bond flies to Switzerland, and he goes to the airport, he gets on an airplane. You don't read, and the author's not going to suddenly stop and go, oh, this is what an airplane is. Describe an airplane, tell you all about it, how they work. No, they won't do that in a novel because they know that you know what an airplane is. And that's how the ancient Indian epics read. They talk about Vimanas and these craft, but they don't go into a lot of detail about them. They just know you know what they are. They're these airships. They're these craft. Well, in 1908, at the Royal Baroda Library in central India, they found this ancient book. And it was from about 400 BC. It had been written from other books. And it was a book only about Vimanas. It was, here it was, like this airplane manual. And they started translating it. It didn't have any photos in it. Or no photos, of course, but no, there were no illustrations. It was just ancient Sanskrit. Sanskrit is, a language that is still, used today, and Sanskrit scholars know ancient Sanskrit. The Vimanika Shastra talked about 4 or 5 different kinds of Vimanas. Some were circular, some were more like zeppelins or cigar-shaped kind of craft. One was like a helicopter, one had wings. They had electricity. They even talked about metals and things in it. I actually republished this whole book with commentary. One of the things they talk about in the Vimanika Shastra is mercury. And it says in there that mercury is part of the craft. And in fact, mercury comes from cinnabar, and cinnabar is a Sanskrit word. So the ancient Indians knew all about mercury. And mercury is curious. Mercury is a metal. It's a liquid. It's a conductor. In mythology, the god Mercury, he flies through the air. He's the messenger god. The symbol of Mercury, the messenger god, is the caduceus, this vortex kind of spiral kind of a thing. Now, as an old friend of mine, he's passed on now. He used to go to a lot of UFO conventions and things. His name was Bill Clendenin. And his whole thing was that the caduceus was this vortex engine, this mercury vortex engine. It's a type of a plasma. It has to do with gyros. Mercury is a liquid. It's a metal. You can electrify it. Plasmas are electrified gases, like neon lights and things like that. But you can have plasmas in a gyro. You can have plasmas in toroids, like a donut kind of a toroid. Smoke rings. are that kind of an effect too. You get into the whole thing of Ezekiel and the Bible is talking about these craft. There was a weird book, it was written in California back in 1886, was called A Dweller on Two Planets by Philos, a Tibetan. In that book, he lives in Atlantis. He talks about these airships. That's a novel really about reincarnation, and but it has a lot about weird inventions and these airships in Atlantis. Back in the turn of the century, too, there was this whole airship thing where these mysterious airships were going across America. And it also started around San Francisco, but then there's certain areas that people saw them. They often had powerful electric lights and things like that on them. And people would yell down. There's a number of books written about it, of course. And right around that same time, the greatest inventor who ever lived, Nikola Tesla, a Croatian, Serbo-Croatian. He was an immigrant. He first went to England, and then he came to New York. He worked for Edison. He was a visionary. He created alternating power that we're using today. He's literally lit the whole world. This guy was a friend of Mark Twain's, George Westinghouse. He is the greatest inventor who ever lived. I mean, the modern world is really created by him because of alternating current and his inventions. But yet he's a suppressed person. Most people don't know who he is. You learn that Otis invented the elevator, and you learn, that Edison invented the light bulb, or the phonograph. He didn't invent the light bulb. But you don't learn about Tesla, because Tesla was a really far-out guy. He invented stuff that even today is like science fiction. They don't want you to know about it, and they kind of keep it secret. And it has to do a little bit with UFOs. You'll see in a minute. One of his students was Guglielmo Marconi, and he's a mysterious guy. And it's thought that he might have faked his death in 1937. He also was a incredible inventor. A lot of Tesla people don't like Marconi because they feel he stole, some of the thunder from Tesla. Marconi is often thought of as being the inventor of the radio. He's not really. Tesla is. Also, another guy around this time, as we get into the 20s and 30s, Albert Einstein. Einstein had, his theory after his special relativity theory called the unified field theory. And the unified field theory had to do with magnetism, electricity, and gravity. And you suddenly have all these things manifesting from the unified field. So suddenly you have electricity, you have gravity, you have magnetism, you have electrogravity, you have electromagnetism, you have magnetogravity, you have equations for all these things. Einstein met with during World War II with the Navy, and this allegedly ended up with the Philadelphia experiment. One of the guys in the 50s who got really interested in the Philadelphia experiment, part of it comes from Tesla and from Einstein, was this guy, Morris K. Jessup. Jessup was one of a well-known, very enthusiastic early UFO investigator, and he sort of got off UFOs. He got into all this unified field stuff with Tesla and Einstein and stuff, and he ended up dead. I mean, he's thought to be one of the early UFO investigators who was murdered. This was in the late 50s. And it was all because he got involved with secret military projects. He corresponded and met with this guy whose name was Carl Allen. Carl Allen, he only died a few years ago in Longmont, Colorado. And he was supposedly the person who spilled a lot of the beans about the Philadelphia experiment. But let's now look at World War II, because so much of modern ufology is coming out of World War II. And one of the things that happened there was the Foo Fighters. As the bombers began flying over Germany, these glowing orbs, pulsing orbs of light started appearing around the bombers, and they called them Foo Fighters. Later, that they said, and in fact, even one of the astronauts, Grissom, he talked about chasing flying saucers around Germany after the war. And they talked about the Germans developing flying saucer type technology. Victor Schauberger, the Schriever-Schreiber type vortex craft. And even later, Janes, talked about this. This is Kenneth Arnold, his early UFO sighting near Mount Rainier, 1947, after World War II. And this is what he saw. And he coined the term flying saucer because what he saw was a boomerang kind of a craft, skipping through the skies, the way he described it, like a saucer. And that's sort of where saucer came in. But it wasn't actually a disc craft, but more of a boomerang craft. And curiously, the Germans had been developing a craft like that, which they called the Horten. And in fact, they developed right up to the Horten 7, which was a craft. But the Horten 18 was a boomerang craft that had gone into like pre-production during World War II. I mean, it's almost exactly what Kenneth Arnold later saw flying around Mount Rainier. Later, photos, it's only been really since the 70s and really 80s and 90s that a lot of photos have come out, a lot of them out of Austria, actually. And that's another story in itself, where a lot of these photos suddenly were released and a documentary appeared in the mid-90s. So you have this whole idea of that there's kind of a secret technology that's being developed, and it's coming from the military. And military stuff, a lot of military stuff is aerospace. Aerospace things are highly, highly driven by the military and kept a secret. And what's kind of strange is, as you look back at all this, is back in World War II, it seemed that there was, and with Tesla and stuff, there was tremendous advances were made. Even in 1949, I mean, the Germans, they were going to Mars. And the Nazis had plans to go to Mars. Can you believe it? Guys like Werner von Braun were brought to the United States. A lot of these Nazi scientists, they couldn't really be taken to, say, Britain. I mean, the feeling against the Germans just was so high there after Battle of Britain, all that, very understandable, of course. But they could be brought to the United States, and they were put in Alamogordo and stuff like that. Right around that time, the 1950s, suddenly, particularly around Los Angeles, if you read the papers in the 50s, almost every day there were reports of flying saucers, fleets of them, flying around. The LA papers were just awash with stories of flying discs. The columnists talked about it. Suddenly, not only were fleets of flying discs and stuff being seen around LA, but of course, little green men had to come along with them. And people like that, Sacramento and stuff like that. It was, particularly in the early 50s, and in California, it was just a common newspaper article, flying saucers. And eventually, since in this case, now, I'm not saying that there's, aliens are out there too, and we'll see some of their stuff in a minute. But the government has got their own projects, and they've been going on for a long time, even before World War II, I believe. And it gets into Tesla technology. It gets into electricity. I mean, and that's part of the whole thing. Spacecraft, flying saucers, and whatever alien technology too, it's electric. It has to do with electricity. This is an interesting site, too, that you probably never have seen because it's only known in New Zealand. This is known as the famous Kaikoura UFO. But every night they would see these flights, and they started filming this one flying saucer that would follow the plane all the time. This was in the 70s. And finally, they filmed it with 16mm film. And the last one frame, this is one frame of this, of the film, where the flying saucer does this total loop right here, all in 1/32 of a second, all on one frame. And the flying saucer was doing it for them, so they would get a good picture of it. It wanted to be filmed. It wanted them to have this picture. Flying saucers too, sometimes, like in the 50s, if you go back to your old UFO books and things, they're sometimes seen hovering around military bases, and what's interesting about this craft is the antenna at the top of it. So you can have that whole thing too. In my books on anti-gravity and the unified field and stuff like that, we talk about T. Townsend Brown. And T. Townsend Brown and the Bonson labs, they were into this whole thing of electrogravity. and Einstein's unified field. This is their lab. Here, look at some of these antennas. They're using discoid craft. They electrify it. It's flying around. They had these oddball antennas that are picking up the craft. This is also part of Tesla's stuff. These toroidal test rigs in vacuums, they basically had, and there's flashes of arcing. These were the flying saucers that they were making in their, here we go. All right, this guy right here, Bill Line, he grew up in Roswell. He became famous in UFO circuits. He claimed that he had gotten what was the compass of a German flying saucer, of all things. So the idea, too, of going, now let's go to the moon. On the moon, the Germans had actually thought they were going to go to the moon and Mars in the early 50s. As we began studying all this whole thing of the moon, and as I wrote my book, Extraterrestrial Archaeology, this whole thing of these rays going around the moon, other structures on the moon, very early on, astronomers noticed certain craters on the moon would be lit up at night. This is what they call translunar lunar light phenomenon. The crater Gassendi would get flashes of light would be seen on it, certain special craters. And in fact, the Apollo missions supposedly went to this area of the moon where they would see a lot of lights and stuff. Many early astronomers saw cities on the moon. They drew pictures. Swiss and French, they would draw this. They had their moon cities, and they were using telescopes. Back then, even as today, people loved watching the moon. The whole idea, too, of the Maria, the Mares, you start to look at features on the moon critically, and it gets weird. The rays that come off the moon, they're supposedly ejected from craters, but they don't really follow along that line. There's areas of the moon, too, that are very square. Other structures seem to be coming off craters and things like that. There's ramps and things. The whole idea of the moon being hollow, supposedly when the stages of the Apollo missions hit the moon rang like a bell for hours. There's talk of bottomless craters on the moon. One of the concepts there is that the moon is an artificial satellite that's hollow, that's been dragged into a special orbit around our planet. There's areas of the moon that are like Monument Valley. They have huge kind of walls and things like that. We don't know what they're for. They seem like very oddball structures on the moon. There's craters that have what appear to be domes and things like that there. The area of Langrenus, and a lot of this is from my book on extraterrestrial archaeology, as the sun was setting, they would see all these domes and stuff like that in the middle of the crater. Craters like Aristelis and stuff like that has these pyramids in the center of the crater. And there would be these clusters. Others didn't have that, like this one. So they would zoom in, and even during the Apollo missions, they told the astronauts, they gave them certain little notebooks and packets and told them what to look for, and look for certain things on the moon when they were going around it. Also in the 70s, right after the Apollo missions, several books came out, and then they were out for a couple of years and they were gone. One was Secrets of Our Spaceship Moon. He also talked, there's a book about, hey, they found pyramids and structures on the moon and stuff like that. These books, unfortunately, did not have photos. Somebody else was on the moon. This book was a fairly famous book for a while. You might find it in some used bookstores if you look hard enough. This did have a small photo section in it. Leonard believed that the moon was occupied. He believed that there was a huge mining operation that was going on in the moon. He claimed that these X-drone kind of things that you see in the middle were moving around the moon, that what they did was they scooped up the moon and processed the moon. The moon has all these rare metals and stuff like that on it. There's chromium, titanium. If you're mining the moon, you've got a tremendous mining session. He felt, too, that there were they were actually repairing the moon because it was some kind of a hollow spaceship. He claimed, too, that certain craters had ejecta coming out of it, like there was all part of a mining operation, and they were spewing moon dust out of the crater, you know, as they processed all the metals and stuff like that. One of the other things that they found on the moon, and that people would note from now and then, is that stuff was moving around on the moon. And even early books on the moon before they went, these things moved around the moon, and they would leave these treads and stuff like that, tread marks behind them. And even they wanted the Apollo astronauts to go and look at these things. So, you know, what moves around on the moon, leaving tread marks behind it? Well, rocks. Rocks roll around on the moon. That's what they said. And one rock, in fact, rolls up out of a crater and then down the other side. I mean, because it can't be things. I mean, in fact, you think of the Star Wars kind of thing, and the first one, where these kind of rumbling machines are sort of moving around. This was one of the things that they had the astronauts looking at. And they were like, they would give these pictures to the astronauts, and they would say, hey, when you're flying around the moon, look at some of this stuff, because we don't know what it is. It looks like there's rivers on the moons. There's little, these indentations and things like this over here. And, I mean, they were like, well, I mean, even they had to ask themselves, are there rivers on the moon? I mean, what are these lava flows or something like that? There's not supposed to be water on the moon, but now they are saying there is. And this is one of the other strange things. And even when you start getting to the backside of the moon, and that's a whole other kind of weird thing about trying to go to the backside, that there's the Tsiolkovsky crater. And it is this weird black eye. I mean, it's this smooth thing with like an island in the middle of it. It looks like a lake on the moon, although it's like a dried lake. And in fact, they wanted the astronauts to look really carefully at it, and it has a few little craters, but it's this smooth plain on the moon. And they didn't know how something like that would have been made. Even back in '61, they were talking about moon cities on the underground bases that would, and yeah, if they had bases on the moon or Mars or something like that, they would be underground, just like they build them here today, underground. There's a whole idea too of this these craters and George Leonard talked about it. There's this one crater, and this is a picture in the book, and they can't find a bottom to it. And it's one of these allegedly bottomless craters going inside the moon. And this would be the top illustration here, where George Leonard, believed too that, yeah, you could actually see a huge, artificial structure going down inside this crater. And, again, the idea is that there are certain entrances into the interior of the moon. Now, there's also this thing of obelisks on the moon, and we're just winding up here, getting towards the end. So the whole idea of Tesla, so Tesla had these death rays, and this is all stuff from the 20s and 30s, before World War II. Tesla had towers, he had these death rays, these huge electrical lights, very much these beams, also tractor beams that could also grab people and pull them up into a craft. Tesla wanted to broadcast power, and this is starting in like 1916. He was going to build these giant towers, and he was going to broadcast power like radio stations, broadcast radio shows and TV stations. He got these patents for these towers and things. And basically, his system that he was going to try and set up would be that electricity would be available everywhere, and you could just set a lamp on a table and turn it on. How about that? He also, with these towers, according to Tesla, there would be these electric airships. They would draw power from his towers. They did not have wings. They were like cigar-shaped craft. They were electric. There was, like the T. Townsend Bonson experiments we saw at the 50. You electrify just like the metallic skin of these craft, and they will levitate. Tesla, this was his vision of the future. These towers would be projecting power. These anti-gravity airships would be hovering around. They have these powerful searchlights and stuff on them. His death rays, too, would be zapping planes if, the the rest of the world still wanted to fight it out. And then there was Tesla died in 1943. And right around that time, too, a group that started in Milwaukee and Chicago moved to California, and they were here in Los Angeles in the 30s. They were a group called the Lemurian Fellowship. And they claimed that they had, insider knowledge from the ancient masters and Atlantis and Lemuria and all that kind of stuff. And one of the interesting things that they claimed was that in Atlantis were these towers, these crystal obelisk towers, and that they broadcast power, like Tesla. And essentially, what these powers were in Atlantis, they claimed, were obelisks. Obelisks themselves are unusual. I mean, their obelisks are giant, monolithic granite towers. They're crystal towers. They're made out of a single block of stone. In Egypt, they're mysterious too. They don't know. Egyptians don't know what they were for. They say they were supposed to be a ray of the sun. Later, many obelisks are still standing in Egypt. Some were taken to Italy and France and England and stuff like that. But later they were carved with hieroglyphs and things like that. But even the way that Egyptians could have carved obelisks, moved them, and then stood them up, they can't figure that out. Nova did a special on this. There's very few books on obelisks to buy. I have all 3 of them, and I wrote one of them. And it amazed me too. They don't have an explanation for obelisks. Like why the Egyptians would build obelisks, erect them, they don't know why. I mean, it's just they looked good. I mean, that's what they're saying. The unfinished obelisk is at Aswan. I mean, they stopped it. This weighs 100 tons, and it's in a stone quarry, and they found that it had a flaw and it had cracked, so they left it there. But the idea, and it's like you can really see this thing, the idea that they're going to move this thing out of this quarry and then move it and erect it, I can tell you today, the modern Egyptian government could not do it. They wouldn't have what it would take. During the 70s, when the Bermuda Triangle books were really hot and people were really interested in that stuff, which was great, there was a couple of oddball books written about the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes triangles. And this was one written by a Canadian guy. This is quite a rare book. Gateway to Oblivion by Hugh Cochrane. In that book, he talks about a weird thing. He talks about this bay on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. And today it's kind of a national park, but in the early 1800s, according to this guy, he said people would go out in rowboats and picnic. And it's kind of a remote area, even today. But there was a couple of towns there. And they would go out, and according to them, an obelisk was in Lake Ontario. There was an obelisk here, and the very tip of the obelisk just barely came to the surface of the lake. And the people would go out on their rowboats and tie their rowboats up to this obelisk and picnic. Then later a storm came, and it was gone. And it was a big storm. So it's a curious idea that in the Great Lakes of North America that there was an obelisk. They think there was an obelisk in front of Tiwanaku as well. Well, how about this? There are obelisks on the moon. There's a thing on the moon. There's a site on the moon called the Blair Cuspids, and it's named after a British astronomer who picked this up. Early Soviet photos of the moon, and Soviet photos of the moon aren't so well known in the U.S. because we've always, emphasized our own space program. But in Europe, Soviet moon photos and stuff are much more known and well analyzed. The Russians themselves got into this whole thing that there's this pattern of obelisks on the moon, including one giant obelisk with a number of them in this grid pattern that goes out. And this would be some ancient thing. Whoever's using the moon the moon sort of as a giant space base. And it would seem, it seems amazing. But yeah, if obelisks were placed on the Earth, it's like, there's obelisks on the moon too. Probably, apparently, because of this kind of power system that, I'm calling it an Atlantean type power system. The whole idea, too, of eclipses, and the moon is so important with this. They think that Stonehenge is a megalithic computer to predict eclipses. And part of the idea there, too, with 2012 and ancient civilizations is that there are these cataclysms that have occurred in the past. They've totally wiped out civilizations. The Mayans knew that, the Egyptians and Plato. And the whole idea, too, here of eclipses, and this has to do with the moon. The moon is the idea of the moon being artificial and being some kind of a spacecraft. The moon, when you have an eclipse of the moon, and the disk of the sun, of the moon, transits the disk of the sun, and then you see the corona of the sun around the moon. But there's a strange thing here, and that is that if the moon is in such a position that when we have a solar eclipse, it perfectly eclipses the sun, it not more or not less, as the disk of the sun, and that's an unusual thing. For instance, if the moon was a little bit closer to the Earth, it would more than cover the sun. If it was a little bit farther from the Earth, it would less than cover the sun. But our moon is in such a position, it not more, not less, covers the sun. And that's a very unusual thing, that our moon would be in a position like that arbitrarily, randomly. It's very unlikely. The odds are a zillion to one that our moon would be in the orbit that it is. And this is what we're talking about, the shadow cast by the moon. And this is where, and not only that, the dark side of the moon's always facing opposite. We can't see it from the Earth. That's unusual too. But the idea that the way during eclipses especially, and it's kind of a strange thing because the ancients, like Stonehenge stuff, they were obsessed with eclipses. They really watched it. They wanted to know whenever there was going to be an eclipse. And so, all this brings us forward to 2012, the future, this future shock that we're all going through, where it seems like everything's just accelerating so fast, and technology is just going so fast for us. But, it's like everything that's happened today has apparently happened in the past, even much of the technology that we had, even horrific wars like Armageddon's, atomic wars kind of fought in the past. It's all kind of recurring again, and this is something I say in all my books, how the history is not what we're taught of, from the so-called experts, that it's like this caveman down here, and then just draw a straight line up, on your graph, and you have modern man. But in reality, history is this roller coaster of ups and downs, of cycles and golden ages and sudden catastrophes and a collapse of civilization. And apparently, a good place to be watching it all is from the moon. So that's the end of my presentation tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it, so thank you.